So I'm going to assume that.
Yes, John. We can.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, great. All right, good. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Willis, and so I wanted to cover, a brief 20 minutes, DevSecOps and a little bit of automated governance. So a little bit of an overview of both of these. You hopefully you got to see Andrew speak. I guess Wednesday. I guess, and Andrew's fabulous. He's my boss actually, and he's put together this incredible team of people. Kevin Bear, who is co-author of the Phoenix Project. That's me, the guy to write, the short guy, and then Jay Bloom works on our team, and he's got a PhD in transition design, and he's just added a lot of sort of smarts to our team. So we're part of Red Hat, and we're trying to look at what DevOps should look like over the next 10 years. I think what we say is we've been involved in a lot of the discussions. Me and Andrew created the first DevOps days in the U.S. I was the first only American at the first DevOps Day event. Andrew likes to say we wrote some books. Kevin, like I said, wrote the Phoenix Project. I'm co-author of DevOps Handbook. I've done a number of other books. Andrew's written, co-authored of Web Operations and Site Reliability. So, we've been a big part of this DevOps community, all four of us. Myself, I've been involved in this industry for 40 years, a little more than 40 years, and I don't list everything on the page because it wouldn't fit. But I started back with Canonical. We worked on one of the first private clouds when Canonical was offering a cloud, and then I was early in at Chef. I sold a company to Dell. I sold a company to Docker, worked at Docker, and just a lot of different things. Also, I'm on the selection committee for DevOps Enterprise Summit as part of IT Revolution. And I've been, now I'm an advisor, but for many years I was a core organizer of DevOps Days. So anyway, the three areas I wanted to sort of go into, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at some of the survey data. I've done longer presentations, so you can look me up. Using my Twitter handle, which is Botchgaloop. It's pretty easy to find. I've got longer versions of analyzing some of the DevSecOps survey data, but I took some of the slides there for this presentation. And then look a little bit at the same thing with the DevOps Battlefield. Again, 20 minutes, I had to cut down some of the stuff, but I've longer about how you have to think about finding these minefields and how do you think about uncovering all these corner and edge cases that could get you in trouble. And then finally, the titled automated governance, and I'll go through what the work I've done there. So recent surveys, there's been a couple. There's two good surveys out there that I think are really important, at least when it comes to DevSecOps. One is the DevSecOps Community Survey. There's been two of those, and so the 2020 came out early this year. It kind of mirrors the DevOps, the DORA, the DevOps survey data, where basically about 7% of the respondents are saying that they sort of do on-demand delivery. Less than 20% are doing multiple times a day. So you could argue that 80% is somewhere in a waterfall-ish mode. Certainly 45% are clearly in every week, monthly, multiple per year. So again, the interesting thing is that we still got a long way to go. And the other interesting point is it does mirror, a little closely to the same data we get out of sort of just the general DevOps survey, not the DevSecOps survey. So there's a ton of other good stuff here. One other thing that I think is interesting in this report is they categorize like what sort of tooling you're using and whether you self-identify it as mature or immature. And I think what's interesting here is if you look at the things to the left of the box, right, the gap is a little tighter between mature and immature. And these are what I would say are sort of things that you would expect organizations to have, in a pipeline, a CI/CD, SAST, probably some initiative around data loss prevention, not so much around the pipeline, but IDS and intrusion detection, protection systems, WAFs and open source governance. But as you move to the right, or the things in the box, these are things that you might consider more advanced things that people are doing, particularly in the pipeline. When you see people doing really sort of deep container security analysis, not just scanning containers, but looking at configurations and looking at sort of Kubernetes configurations or Docker configurations. There's a lot of danger zones there with permissive configuration definitions. And then DAST, or software component analysis, or AST, right? And the other thing that's interesting is notice the gap is like much bigger. So it just tells me that there's a lot of opportunity for improvement when we use the sort of terminology of DevSecOps. And so the battlefield, one of the things I've done quite a bit over the last few years is, about 3 or 4 years ago, I started really looking into security and DevOps. A woman named Shannon Leitz coined the term DevSecOps. She's a brilliant woman over at Intuit, and she's been somewhat my mentor. But I've been looking at I do this work where I interview hundreds of people in an organization, and I try to get really sort of strip out all the sort of frameworks, and even though a lot of the DevOps tools that are amazing, like lean value stream mapping or chain mapping or Worley mapping, and there's just a number of good tools. I do find that for me, it's better to go in and have a conversation before we even talk about some of those prescriptive models or patterns or practices. And what I find is there are these patterns. I call them the 7 deadly sins of DevOps. And what's interesting is, I won't go through all these, but invisible work, lots of different types of systems for ticketing and misalignment. If you've read the Phoenix Project, sort of tribal knowledge, the Brents, there's always some Brents in an organization, incongruent organizational design, managing complexity, blamelessness. But what's interesting is they always funnel down to what I call security and compliance theater, which in almost all cases, when I spend this amount of time with an enterprise, that I'm able to look a CIO in the face and say, or in the eyes and say, your audits are really sort of theater. They're not, they don't reflect reality, right? And it's an interesting conversation. But we'll get into why I'm really interested in automated governance and why I think that starts to solve that problem. So so when I talk about the minefields, I think one of the things, that there's been a lot of good literature around cognition, cognitive biases, and I think most notably probably John Allspar, and the work he's done with adaptive capacity labs. He draws from some individuals like Sidney Decker, and again, I can get you a list of some of these resources. But the point I want to make is one of probably the dangerous things to risk or security, or just in general, how we manage, sort of catastrophes or harmful events in our enterprises, is sort of root cause thinking. And so I want to show you 2 examples. This was the famous Equifax breach, which basically was a library called Struts2 and a method called Jakarta, which meant if you were running this back-leveled, or this at the time, it was the highest criticality you can get from the NIST in terms of a vulnerability. And you could basically run a curl command and just, if this was on an unauthorized system, you could be out anywhere. And if you hit, the right IP that was a Tomcat container, you basically could run your command, and then as they call a kill chain would have begun, right? And so, but what was interesting is when it was all said and done, all the sort of positioning was that, the real problem was there was a person who didn't deploy the patch. Now, if you've been paying attention to any of the DevOps discussions over the last couple of years, we know that's just not, it's not a healthy way to think. It's a blame, and it hides the real problems. And what's interesting is there's an incredible document that was created by the U.S. government that did a really deep and in-depth analysis of this breach. So by itself, it's just a learning opportunity, because they walk through the kill chain. But when you read it, you get to realize that there was so many other factors involved with this problem. There was the intrusion detection systems on the perimeter had 18-month expired certs at the time of the breach, right? That's just a whole nother problem. Like some script didn't update DNS 18 months before the breach happened. There was organizational design issues where the chief security officer reported to chief legal officer and never notified the CIO of the breach. And it was just list after list, right? So the point is that security is not just about putting scans and vulnerability and SaaS. It's actually applying all the things we're learning from DevOps about cognitive dissonance, about cognitive biases. Again, I really encourage you to sort of read some of Sidney Decker's work, Drift into Failure, or Field Guide to Human Engineering. Both excellent books. They don't really deal with IT, but they explain how people who investigate airplane crashes and hospital catastrophes. Just quickly, same sort of scenario with the they didn't configure it. They took all the defaults, and one of the defaults was bypass was on. So that question mark URL equals, that's the Amazon metadata server. It happened to be on an authorized system. This is what they call server-side request forgery. So my point of these two things is thinking about security and all these things. Really, you have to think through how people think about problems. Blameless. Are you becoming a learning organization? Are you looking for opportunities of failure to learn, or are you looking at failure to blame? Right. It's a big difference of how you progress and how you become a sort of a high performance organization. So if we drill into to automated governance, right, which is the sort of my most sort of passionate piece of this thing. I've been heavily involved in this. I've been fortunate enough to be working with Gene Kim for many years now. I met him when he was halfway done with the Phoenix Project. We co-authored a couple of books together, including the DevOps Handbook. And Gene, and I'm also on the selection committee for the DevOps Enterprise Summit. But so Gene, after we ran the first DevOps Enterprise Summit a few years back, I think 7 years ago, we did a survey, and then a bunch of us got together in Portland to sort of address the survey. What did we hear? And then we've over the years, each year we turn that into.
We can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, well, I don't know why, because have you not been able to see it all the whole time, or just now?
No, just now.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure what happened.
Refresh the.
Okay. Can you see now?
No, no yet.
I'm not sure what happened. So you don't see anything?
No.
Because I hadn't done anything different. Let's see. All right, let me go ahead and.
Please, could you please refresh the page?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. All right, so try to do that here. All right.
Yes, now we can see.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what happened there. It's just it's a bug in the software, I guess. All right. So anyway, so over the years, we work on these papers. If you go to itrevolution.com, there's a pull down option for papers, foreign papers. And back in 2015, there was a paper called Unlikely Union, DevOps and Audit. In 2018, there was a Dear Auditor, which is a real interesting paper where it's an apology letter to auditors, but it actually has a lot of detail in terms of how things that so we promised to make sure we get better at. And then last year, I worked on a team, and I'll tell you about the team in a minute, where we really wanted to try to see if we could try something that hadn't been tried anymore, and we called it DevOps Automated Governance. And this idea of DevOps Automated Governance went back to, again, Capital One in 2017 had written this article about how they did pipelines. And one of the things they did in that article is they talked about their pipeline design. And they said that they had a structure where if a team wanted to actually, this was, in essence, the way at this time that you could bypass like CAB or Centralized Authority Board for approval, like manual approval or sort of, gated approval. if you could show these 16 things, then you would be able to, for certain services and applications, be able to auto deploy without having to get, you don't have to get or get auto approved, right? And so at the same time, Google had come out with a really cool open source project or something that they had done internally called Grapheus. And I started having conversations with a couple of people about, well, if we're going to create these control points, and everybody was doing this somewhat like this, shouldn't that also be evidence? So, so what I did is, last year I had the opportunity to put together a team. Mike Nygaard over at Sabre, the airline reservation system, Topopal, Capital One, Stephen McGill, Sam Gruckenheimer from Microsoft, myself, John Rezatowski from PNC Bank, Dwayne Holmes, who was over at Marriott at the time, Courtney Kisher at Nike. And so we all got together and we worked on this reference architecture. And the general idea of this reference architecture was, I had the idea of like, could we change subjective attestation? So what I mean attestation is evidence, just evidence for audits. Can we change subjective evidence or attestation to objective attestation or evidence? And what that means is typically audits, an auditor comes in and looks at change records, and change records have human sort of descriptions and paragraphs about how things work. And they're really decoupled from the actual activities that really happen. And then there's a lot of sort of back and forth about what does this sentence mean? Where's the screen prints? What if we could make this a non-human transaction so we could create digital signatures of all the things that an auditor needs to see in sort of a loosely formed blockchain, sort of a chain of digital signatures that is a digital signature. So what the goal was for this was that, so imagine most organizations, large enterprises, financial institutions, tend to waste about, and I say waste, they go through a sort of an exercise about 30 days a year, and it's pretty painful, a lot of waste and toil. What if we could create a model where it could be a half a day a year, or even 0 day if it's just automated and it's just continuous? Also, as people do more and more modern, your containers, your Kubernetes, your microservices, just all sorts of things, that get technically more complicated. The gap between sort of the risks that were written like in 1990 for most large institutions and what you're doing are completely separate, and that's why I call it sort of security and compliance theater. So if in a sense that your efficacy of your audits are like low 20%, what if we can get that high 90%? And then what if we really gave you, sort of like the Capital One example, could we give you a really sort of models that you can consistently migrate people away from a change authority board, change reviewers, change approvals. And so what we did is we sat down and we architect a reference structure based on a set of stages and a pipeline. But the main goal was to think about how would you create boundaries for evidence and control. So we came up with 7, deployment, build, package, non-deploy, deploy. And then what's interesting is even though sort of dependency management and artifact manager are actually part of the software package deploy, those two had to have their own cycle as well, right? Because they're constantly getting updated. And then we looked at like common controls and common actors for each one of the stages. And then again, I would it's a Creative Commons, so you can download it for free. You can share and share alike. So there's pages and pages of explanations of all these, but I'll just run through some of the examples. Like for example, in the source code repository, the control and evidences would be like a peer review, some percentage of unit test coverage, dependency, scan, static code analysis, build stage. You might have control and evidence that did it come from source control? Otherwise, no. Or was it immutable? Was the unit testing? Was just there a static security analysis? And then their dependency managers do things like license check, security check, how long, age, and where did what did the artifact come from an approved external source? With improved versions, how old was it? Some sort of making sure that the artifact is not stale. Same thing, very similar package stage, right? Package stage, but a package stage and you think about today, most things get delivered as a package. It's either a package that's maybe an AMI, it's a package that's a jar file, it's a package that's a container, or it's a package that's a function, right? And so when you think about it in terms of a package, it has some unique control and evidence opportunities. Like, is it digitally signed? Did you scan that package? We know that like a Docker image is not just code. It could be scripts. It could be configuration definitions. It could be options that could be create, sort of vulnerabilities, not just the code itself or the library, but depending on the flags or the settings that you have, you could actually create vulnerabilities. And then if you're going to apply at operations time metadata, maybe a zookeeper-like functionality, you're making sure that the metadata that's going to come from can't be compromised. And the artifact stage, very similar, the prod stage, and then there's sort of an end-to-end structure. And then I won't go through each of these, but what we did is we tried to prototype where would things come from, like unit tests maybe from SonarQube, or clean dependencies from Checkmarks or Nexus, or just on and on with each stage. So again, a lot of detail in the guide. One last thing I wanted to talk about here is the sort of notion of policy as code. So one of the organizations has taken this a lot further. We're actually going to start a second working group here in a couple of weeks. And with this particular scenario, the idea was that since we had that framework implemented for sort of attestations and control, the idea is create a human readable construct in YAML files that can describe from the policy people. Now, service people can go to the policy people. They can work together to implement non-human intervention-based control and attestation. And so what this does is it has so many benefits, but first, and that becomes an artifact too. So the attestation is the actual code, the YAML code, but it also creates a very tight feedback loop. And then we were also, if you're familiar with the Kubernetes admin controller, or OpenShift from Red Hat, we've been able to sort of do a translation of those YAML files into Rego, so you can actually make this effective on with the use of OPA. So and then I think I'm at my 20 minutes. There's some really interesting stuff around cloud automated governance. Again, I can point you to here's a document that you might want to sort of look at, and it's another working group that I worked on with some large banks and healthcare organizations about getting cloud providers. We made the walls, getting cloud providers to send at their attestations back to us. That's it. So if you're a tenant or consumer, and we've got this model of attestations and control, what if we could ask the cloud providers to give us sort of integrity on their boot sequence, or a mirror back on all the requests, so we can look for denial of service, or server-side request forgery, or standardization. And then the idea was to ask all the cloud providers to give a standard format. So we're actually, our second version of this is really looking good. We've got a couple of cloud providers involved. So we're really trying to create you think about like SNMP for cloud events, right? It's a pretty cool one. And we did some Gherkin governance as code. Anyway, I think I'm at my 20 minutes there, maybe a little over. I apologize, but that's a quick run of DevOps automated governance. It's a little bit about DevSecOps in terms of surveys and how you need to think about things.
So thank you so much for your presentation, Jan. We are really glad for having you this year at the event. Yeah. And we really hope having you next year at the Devops Bogota.
Oh, it would be fun to go there. I would love to. I would just, once this COVID thing is over, boy, it would be just a pleasure and an honor to come down there and visit with you all. So,
thank you so much.
All right.
Bye. Bueno, ahora vamos a continuar con Carlos Chávez desde Perú.